So, today on the podcast, we continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair, the person many people consider to be Walt's favorite artist. As we left off last time, Mary, Rolly Crump, and others were finalizing those 5 large It's a Small World stages so they could be trucked to the New York World's Fair at the start of 1964. And that is exactly where we pick up our story today, as the center of activity shifts from California to New York, into spaces where Mary again will bring in Lee into social areas around her work with Disney. And so, if you're ready, let's go. Now that the Small World stages were finalized, the focus was on moving the attraction stages from California to New York. Every set and figure was built in California, Mary Blair explained. Taken apart just as a set is when a show is on a road and shipped east by truck for reassembly here. Disney had never shipped attractions across country. The usual route was from either the studio or WED over to Disneyland, often at night, a little less than 40 miles. Even with this short distance, if a figure or stage was delicate, they would transport it in a slow truck after midnight when the roads were empty. The concern now was in protecting all 4 of the Disney rides for the World's Fair as they were transported across country, about 2,800 miles. WED employees assumed that many attraction pieces would make the trip with little difficulty. The enormous mechanical dinosaurs for the Ford Magic Skyway, the full-size human animatronics for both the Carousel of Progress and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and of course the enormous Tower of the 4 Winds, now arranged into 7 trucks to be reassembled at the fair. But the Small World figures were small and delicate. Some dolls held fragile props such as musical instruments, a spyglass, a fishing rod, and a shepherd's cane. Beyond this, the decorative toy figures were constructed of materials similar to papier-mâché. Small World was the attraction about which WED employees were most concerned being damaged in transit. On the receiving end in New York was Mary. The site for the New York World's Fair was, by sheer coincidence, about 12 miles from the Blair's house in Great Neck. As the crates were taken to the barn-like show building and then unpacked, she inspected all of the show elements. Only one piece was damaged in a truck accident, she explained, and it was replaced here immediately. During this same period, Walt was filming and had already filmed behind-the-scenes footage of the fair attractions for his weekly television show. The episode would be assembled over many months, showing the attractions during many stages of development. It would include footage of Walt and Rolly inspecting the Tower of the 4 Winds just outside the Key Light building, as well as Walt standing next to one of the mechanical dinosaurs arranged on a soundstage in Burbank. It would include footage shot months earlier of craftspeople finalizing the caveman figures for the Ford Magic Skyway. Walt would save space at the end of the episode for a 15-minute insert to be shot later during the opening ceremonies at the fair itself. But one of the longest segments was arranged inside a recreation of the WED model shop, as behind Walt, various artists worked on figures for the fair. Walt's preference was to reward key artists at his studio with on-screen appearances. In these segments would be Blaine Gibson and Rolly Crump. For his part, Rolly stood next to a model of the tower and demonstrated how its colorful propellers and various animal figures would move. He also explained to the audience its impressive height. But for reasons now unknown, Mary did not appear on screen. The most likely explanation is that she was at home with her family in New York, but Walt clearly felt a need to include her on air. For the Small World segment, Walt was positioned in front of an early model created for one of 5 stage areas. The TV used the model almost certainly because all of the full-size stages were now either in trucks or in New York. But next to Walt, typically where a key artist would stand, situated on a small plywood platform, was the Mary Blair doll made by Raleigh. Almost surely this was a duplicate Mary Blair doll made for the TV show, as the real one was on its way to New York. But this one looked nearly identical, with the chicken feather hair, the tiny nose, and the poncho patterned with oversized daisies. The only noticeable difference here was that the flower poncho was a chalky blue, while the one made for New York was mustard brown. Walt stood next to the figure with his elbow on the plywood, leaning in a little to the figure. The camera framed them as colleagues in discussion, with Walt on the right-hand side of the frame and the Mary Blair doll on the left. Walt never explained the doll nor talked to it while being filmed. He simply stood there, almost surely a silent way to include one of his favorite artists on TV with him, if only as a miniature representation, as he talked about a ride that was a musical journey through her unique imagination. Walt's inclusion of Mary, if only through a doll designed to represent her, was in sharp contrast to how her family life was unfolding in New York. Lee was often gone, mostly at work. Sometimes on the weekends he worked on his personal paintings. When Lee and Mary went out or had friends over, he could be garrulous and charming, but by this point there were 2 noticeable tones in Mary's home life, which even some of her son's friends had begun to notice. One where Lee attempted to be an ideal and charming husband, and one where he slipped into depression, often fueled by disappointment, petty jealousies, and alcohol. In New York, protest expanded in the early months of 1964. In February, thousands demonstrated against school segregation, with many children attending alternate freedom schools, managed by volunteers where children received lessons in Black history and learned skills for social change. In March, protesters targeted construction sites in Manhattan and Brooklyn, where African Americans and Puerto Ricans were often excluded from well-paying, skilled positions. In early April, 75 civil rights protesters blocked entrances at the fairs, stopping deliveries. We won't be able to do much the day it opens, one protester explained, so we're starting now. After 30 of these protesters were arrested, other demonstrators considered ways to disrupt the fair during its opening week. The plan that received the most attention was to block roads that led to the fair, something the mayor called, unfortunate and ill-chosen as well as illegal. But in case police found ways to keep the roads open, groups considered ways to protest inside the fair. Members of civil rights groups would come to the fair, many of them in buses, enter the grounds, and demonstrate in various ways. By this point, the Disney team had a couple dozen workers in New York. Disneyland sent operations managers to hire locals to be hourly staff for It's a Small World. They also sent members of their small construction team. Beyond this, WED had a few people on site to check installation. Most of this work, as it was straightforward, was handled by local unionized workers, with Mary and other people from Disney supervising. Mary would come into the grounds for the day and then return home. During these weeks, she noticed political tensions rise in the city. In terms of the fair, the protest plans initially were for peaceful and informative demonstrations particularly at a speech that President Johnson would give about the United States' involvement and the fair's theme of unity. But in the weeks leading up to the fair, protesters considered more disruptive and theatrical actions. These included protesters climbing the 12-story Unisphere, which was the symbol of the fair, placing a demonstrator on the plastic orange atop the 112-foot Florida Tower that offered free samples of orange juice and an hourly water ski show, and disrupting a jazz session in the Louisiana Pavilion by displaying electrified cattle prods like those that had been used against many civil rights demonstrations in the South. At the same time, union workers tried to slow work largely so large companies such as Disney, Pepsi, and Ford, as well as the New York Fair Corporation itself, would be forced to pay them overtime to finish the fair. One Disney employee, John Bowman, who worked as a construction manager, recalled that a number of the New Yorkers told him, "You'll never open on schedule." Union workers insisted they do all of the skilled work, while the staff from Disney watched from a distance. This frustrated many who were trying to install the attractions as quickly as possible. At this exact time, Disney was planning to bring in other designers to finalize installation and ready the attractions to open. Among those artists was Rolly Crump, then 34 years old, who had never before visited New York. His plan was to live at a hotel near the fair and then walk or cab in every day, where he'd be joined by other Disney artists. The more established employees at WED were often confused by Raleigh, his eccentricities and enthusiasm, a person decades younger than themselves. They were also concerned that Raleigh might not understand the problems inside Mary's home, especially with Lee. John Hench, who was then 55 years old, took Raleigh aside. A lot of Lee's drinking had to do with Mary, Hench explained. He said that Mary was an artist on a high plateau and that Lee, though a gifted colorist, simply couldn't reach that same level of achievement. Raleigh felt he understood. He had seen Lee in California when he visited with Mary, and had glimpsed his quiet jealousies around the studio. A few days later, Raleigh left for New York. New York was colder than he had expected, with lows in the 30s and highs occasionally breaking into the 50s. He checked into a hotel not far from other Disney and WED employees, but Mary was his personal guide to the city. She was now dressed in her New York clothes, which were more sophisticated and formal than the clothes she wore while in California. Also, they were warmer. "Well, I thought Mary was a striking-looking person," Raleigh said. "I was attracted to all aspects of her. Wasn't just because she was a woman, was because of her talent, the way she dressed, her personality." They spent time at the fair working with installation, but in the evenings, Mary introduced him to the city. "She took me to the restaurants and bars," Raleigh explained. "She showed me everything, including the Museum of Modern Art. The museum featured special exhibits on abstract watercolors and urban photography. It also featured an exhibit on drawings made by Robert Rauschenberg, in which he visually interpreted Dante's Inferno, which was more or less at the other end of the topical spectrum compared to It's a Small World." Raleigh and Mary had meals. They had drinks, both of them with martinis. She even took him on her errands. One dress shop was inside of an apartment, Raleigh explained. Got on an elevator, got off 5th floor, went down to apartment 43, opened the door, and it was a dress shop. There you have a glass of wine, you sat down, and Mary tried on clothes. The uncomfortable moments happened with Lee, who believed that Mary might be romantically interested in Raleigh, a man 20 years younger and in far better physical shape than himself. "We were in a restaurant one night," Rolly explained, and he got real drunk. At one point, Lee looked around the room, sizing up other men. Then his eyes fell on Rolly, who was about 6 feet tall, reasonably athletic, and sported light brown hair neatly clipped above his ears. "Well, I've got muscles too," Lee said. For his part, Raleigh understood the underlying issues now. "Mary and I were very close," he said, but he maintained that his affection for her was as a friend and as a fellow artist who admired her ability. For her part, Mary, though embarrassed, was now good at putting such moments behind her, and then doing her best to well up an atmosphere of normalcy. Raleigh could see the best way to support Mary was to simply ignore these moments and to allow her to focus on other areas of her life. But Raleigh sensed something more in this now. He knew people like John Hench had likely been correct. She drank, Raleigh said, because of an unhappy marriage. For the most part, though, Mary and Raleigh spent their time at the fair. "She and I actually went every day to the installation," Raleigh said, "and helped to make sure everything was put in the proper place, and were there right on the site." Now, inside the enclosed show building, they focused on a final arrangement for stage lighting, matching their plans to the actual environment. The ride began with the European stage. For this, Mary drenched the room with a dozen gels, showing unique color values existing side by side. Blues and greens illuminated Africa, a wave of yellow sheeted down around Asia, and the finale was accomplished with a blaze of white and silver. As with the dolls that were both similar in construction and unique in costume, the light sections suggested a similar dichotomy. Light patterns in each region were unique, but their purity and potency suggested that there was something similar in each region as well. Now that the stages were arranged and lit in their final environment, Mary and Raleigh saw that their visual presentation lacked some small element of spectacle. The painted sets, Raleigh said, even though they were gorgeous pieces, looked kind of flat, especially when you compared them to all those toys and moving figures that were decorated with glitter and jewels. So we bought about $250 worth of glitter. Nowadays, $250 worth of glitter doesn't sound like a lot, but back then it was an obscene amount. We put glue on the sets and blew glitter all over them to give them depth. Though Raleigh didn't keep a record of the exact weight purchased, $250 would have purchased many hundreds of pounds of bulk glitter in 1964. During the week of April 19th, Disney brought in more designers and executives for the fair's opening. Among them were Dick Irvine, head of WED, retired Admiral Joe Fowler, head of Disneyland Construction, Mark and Alice Davis, and John Hench. At the pavilion, crews began to cycle corporate guests, construction workers, and Disney managers through the ride, largely to test animatronics and to train the ride operators who had been locally hired. Among those who were test riders on the boats were the songwriters Bob and Dick Sherman, who were there shortly before opening when one of the mishaps occurred. The scenes looked marvelous and everything was working fine until we were about a third of the way through the ride, when suddenly the sound went off. Then just as suddenly it came back on, playing backwards at high speed, the brothers explained. We were with several people who had worked on Small World. We were really enjoying it for a while, but 35 to 40 feet into it, and for some strange reason, the sound started going backward and then stopped. Bob was in the boat about 2 boats ahead of me. I was in the last boat. It was just the click, click, clack, the sound of the animatronic dolls. And I looked at Bob and he said, "Okay." We sang the whole thing all the way. It was very memorable to me. We gave a personal performance that first ride. As the opening approached, Rolly found that he was spending all of his time at the fair without time for essential chores such as laundry. With a pile of dirty clothes, he left his hotel room early one morning to wash them when the local laundromat opened. He stood by the glass door looking inside and counting the minutes until it opened, when two police officers approached him, one of whom put a firm hand on his shoulder. Rolly could see they wanted to question and possibly arrest him. Apparently some guy was extorting the place and they thought it was me, Rolly explained. I pulled out my ID to show them and said, I'm just Rolly Crump from California, in town working for Disney, and I want to get my goddamn laundry. They looked at his driver's license and could see that he was, in fact, from California. Then they laughed. One of the officers, raising his eyebrows with comic exaggeration, said, "Okay, Mickey Mouse, we believe you. Now get out of here." In the days leading up to the fair's opening, civil rights activists claimed they would block roads leading to the fair. They would disrupt speeches. They would bring in thousands of people to challenge police and chant slogans such as "Jim Crow must go," expressing the need to repeal discriminatory laws based on racial segregation. Mary was anxious to see how the public would react to her ride, though she never mentioned this. The populism of her work, that it was positioned for mass consumption, remained a quiet point of contention in her marriage. A successful gallery showing, which still interested Lee, though prestigious, might bring in a few thousand visitors. But the World's Fair was projected to bring in tens of millions of visitors, with perhaps as many as 10 million people experiencing the ride based on Mary's visual designs. She would be there on opening day along with Rolly and Walt. Lee was invited as well. She also wanted to bring her kids, so they would be able to remember this moment. But this again brought her some anxiety, as her teenagers were at times difficult to control and could easily speak out of turn or say something inappropriate. This was particularly true for Devon, who at times acted impulsively. She was nervous about the boys, Alice Davis explained. The kids might do something that might aggravate Walt. But Mary was excited to be at the opening. It had been years since she had been deeply involved with a project arranged by Walt. The morning of April 22nd, opening day, was overcast, with rains at times sheeting down from the sky. Visitors to the fair wore synthetic ponchos and jackets. The rain likely contributed to a lower number of protesters than initially planned, but demonstrations did happen. In terms of traffic disruptions, there was one serious attempt to stop a subway train by pulling an emergency cord. A group of drivers intending to disrupt traffic near the fair by driving extremely slowly were arrested early in the morning, which left roads open for visitors wishing to arrive by car. Inside the grounds, civil rights groups staged a few sit-ins designed to delay pavilion openings and a few protests, with participants shouting "Freedom Now." A group of protesters booed and shouted slogans at President Johnson when he dedicated the federal pavilion. In response, President Johnson acknowledged that citizens had a right to voice their discontent. "We do not try to disguise our imperfections or cover up our failures," he said to the crowd. He then predicted that America would work toward being a world in which all men are equal. This drew performative laughter from a few people in the crowd. After the president's speech, protesters who continued to block fair areas, largely by sitting on sidewalks and in the shrubbery, were threatened with arrest. But aside from exchanges like this, the disruptions were minor. Though fair officials had projected 250,000 guests as the fair opened, actual attendance was less than half of this, 92,646, with roughly 30,000 of those being comped admissions, which included reporters and photographers, designers and their guests such as Rolly and Mary, and also various dignitaries such as Walt Disney and President Johnson. In talking to the press, Walt said that the fair is similar to Disneyland, but much, much bigger. We were called in because of our experience in moving people and showing three-dimensional exhibits. As for Mary, she was there with Lee and Kevin, as well as one of Kevin's friends from school. Donovan ended up not going. Mary was dressed elegantly in black and white with an overcoat and sunglasses. Her hair was neatly cut in a way to radiate the elegance of the big city. Though It's a Small World would be officially dedicated by UNICEF later in the week. The ride opened with a parade of Disney characters moving through the pavilion, costumes typically worn by cast members at Disneyland, now arranged to greet guests as they moved through the fair. The president of Pepsi, Don Kendall, said a few words at a podium, then introduced Walt, who spoke about the ride and its vision for harmony and world peace. Then the ride was officially open. Visitors didn't buy tickets from a ticket window. Instead, they bought passports from a passport window to board the ride. The first guests were executives from Pepsi, including Don Kendall, who were accompanied by retired Admiral Joe Fowler, head of Disneyland Construction. All of them in dark suits, they sat in one boat and moved through the attraction. When they got to the unload station, one executive asked, "Well, Admiral, could we possibly have another ride?" Fowler looked at these men sitting there like excited children. "Well, of course, gentlemen," he said, "we will." Mary spent much of her time that day in a VIP lounge located in the two-story building at the base of the Tower of the Four Winds. They were on the second story with views overlooking the loading area for the ride. Mary could see boats of guests moving through the show building that would take them into a world of her own making, a world without strife, anger, jealousy, or other problems. It was a world filled with peace. Much to her satisfaction, her opening day was largely filled with peace as well. Lee was on good behavior, Kevin acted respectfully around adults, and he mainly spent time with his friend Neil from school. Neil had brought an 8mm home movie camera, and the two of them took in shots of the festivities, making their own personal documentary of the day. As for Rolly, he enjoyed the attraction, but was still irritated at what engineers had done to his lovely tower. "Well, I remember being there on opening day, and my big, ugly tower was there," he said. As he recalled, it was generally a joyous day, except for that. "Yeah, we were drinking," he said. "We lived on martinis. We were all celebrating." He would later say, "Mary and I stood above in the Tower of the Four Winds, looking down and watching people get into the boats and coming out. We were all up there at the VIP lounge. Walt was there as well. A beautiful day." By all accounts, Lee was gracious and even charming, which greatly helped Mary enjoy the day. She could see now that she had designed a ride that projected not only her artistic vision, but also advanced a political message of world harmony that took on greater importance in America following Kennedy's assassination. Mary, as well as her guests, stayed for most of the day. Then they went home. Within the first month, the attraction was visited by the Secretary General of the UN, as well as United Nations representatives from the USSR, Canada, Nicaragua, Germany, and India. It was visited by Jacqueline Kennedy, one of her first appearances since the death of her husband. There she saw an entire attraction that presented children similar to those in I Can Fly, a book that her family loved. The fair continued to attract protests focused on racial equality, with protesters planning to create counter-exhibits near pavilions hosted by southern states to highlight racial inequalities there. But in terms of employment, at least, the fair was more diverse than previous fairs, as many corporations and sponsors had a greater sense of equality and representation. It would be difficult for corporations not to embrace hiring equality at a fair where Small World was a featured attraction. Sponsors of other Disney attractions consciously strove for diversity in their pavilions, often hiring students from historically black colleges. The Ford Pavilion, which included many Disney elements, had hired 26 African American hosts as part of its overall workforce. The General Electric Pavilion hired 10. In defining its public stance on equality, a General Electric employee newsletter explained, "When you visit General Electric's Progress Land at the New York World's Fair, you will find reassuring evidence that progress for General Electric means human progress no less than technical progress." The extent of these hires was by no means ideal, nor did they correspond to the diversity in neighborhoods that surrounded the fair, but it was a start, an initial move toward a greater equality. The problems for Mary, however, were not presently focused on the fair. She would take a small break from work, though already Walt was considering other projects that might bring her back to Disney. She would focus her time at home for a while, though, of course, that is where the real problems existed for her, simmering quietly inside her house. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to have one of our monthly news and analysis episodes up next week. And on Bandcamp, I've just stitched together the 25 parts of the Life and Art of Herb Ryman series. If you're enjoying our series on Mary Blair, this was another series from a few years ago, where we looked at the work of another key Disney artist throughout his career. An artist whose life, like that of Mary Blair, spanned many projects at Disney and elsewhere. But Ryman's work, particularly in his later years, was far more focused on the development of the parks where he worked closely with Walt. In terms of Walt's overall vision for the parks, Ryman was very much his key concept artist, an artist who stayed with the parks long after Walt's passing. All 25 parts are now arranged as a continuously playing album over on Bandcamp. As for my book, Making Mary Poppins, it came out this past Tuesday. There was a really nice write-up of it in the Wall Street Journal this past Friday, and in terms of events this coming week, I'll be in an online discussion with the Baltimore County Public Library about the book on Wednesday, November 19th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And next Sunday, November 23rd, I'll be at Oxford Exchange in Tampa at 3:30 to read from, sign, and talk about the book. If you happen to be in the Tampa area, come by. I would love to meet you in person. I'll leave links to get the book and also to the events down in the show notes. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.